She walked into a courtroom like any other, no badge, no lawyer, no entourage, just a folded form in her hand and a scar above her temple that no one noticed at first. But when the judge opened her file, he froze. Not because of what she said nothing, but because of what he recognized. In a room built on rules and routine, time stopped. The gavel never dropped. The judge stood at attention. Who was she? Why did the system erase her name by sundown? And why did everyone in that room feel history shift without understanding why? Subscribe now, because this is the kind of story they won't teach you in law school. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper, disinfectant, and the worn fatigue of bureaucracy. She moved through it without hesitation, bypassing the security checkpoint with nothing but a folded form in her hand and a gray wool coat too light for the weather. No badge, no briefcase, no sound beyond her footsteps. Her hair was pinned back loosely, strands of silver and black pulled away from her face, just enough to reveal the faded scar near her right temple, a thin, angled mark that seemed more deliberate than accidental. But no one looked closely enough to notice. She took her place in line behind a man arguing quietly with his lawyer and a woman fumbling through a zippered folder of receipts. The atmosphere buzzed with the kind of tension found in places where decisions are made by strangers. Small claims, code violations, minor disputes. The presiding judge had a reputation for efficiency and a heavy hand on time limits. No one came here expecting justice, only resolution. She stood alone, her back straight, her expression unreadable. The folded form in her hands remained untouched, gripped with the steadiness of someone who did not fidget, who did not second-guess the weight of her own actions. She wore no jewelry. Her shoes were plain and clean. There was no cell phone in sight. When the clerk leaned into the microphone and mispronounced her name, the last syllables twisted and softened into something unfamiliar. She stepped forward. "Present," she said, her voice calm and even. She did not correct him. Her eyes swept briefly across the courtroom before settling forward. She made no effort to explain her case, to whisper strategy to a lawyer, or to gauge the room's reaction. To anyone watching, she appeared as one more citizen trying to navigate a system designed to confuse. A solitary figure with no visible power, seeking some bureaucratic relief on a Monday morning. But the judge had not yet opened her file. And no one, not yet, understood who was standing at the front of the room. The judge had seen hundreds of files pass through his hands, grievances scrawled in cheap ink, complaints dressed up as formal petitions, boilerplate language arranged like the scaffolding of fragile hope. He worked methodically, page by page, stack by stack, rarely pausing to consider the person behind the paper. Justice at this level wasn't personal, it was procedural. He reached for her folder without looking up, already scanning the header before her presence had registered. Case ID, filing date, petition to review administrative determination. Nothing unusual. No legal representative listed. No cross-reference from higher jurisdiction. The kind of self-represented request that typically ended in dismissal or delay. He flipped to the second page, eyes still dulled by the rhythm of repetition. Then something changed. It was not dramatic. He didn't gasp or freeze, but his posture shifted barely. He straightened slightly in his chair. His fingers paused mid-turn, resting lightly against the corner of the page, as if sensing something under the paper itself. The courtroom continued murmuring behind him. A cough, a muffled ringtone, the hushed scrape of plastic binders. But for him, the noise dropped away. He turned to page 3. It was there half-sealed under a clear classification overlay. A watermark bearing the faded emblem of an interagency task directive. A string of designations not used in public systems. The kind of language meant for internal review only. The kind that wasn't supposed to exist within municipal jurisdiction. He leaned forward now. Slowly. The previous page was re-examined, then the one before that. His thumb moved along the document's binding, locating the insert. He removed his glasses, not out of necessity, but reverence. The next page was stamped with a declassification tag, partial and temporary. Beneath it, a date, a code name, a field authority signature he recognized but hadn't seen in over 20 years. From the petitioner's table, she didn't move. She hadn't flinched when he paused. She hadn't looked up. Her eyes remained forward, calm, still. She wasn't waiting for a verdict. She was waiting for recognition. The judge's hand, always precise, now hovered just above the page. The courtroom didn't notice. Not yet. But something had shifted. The file was no longer unremarkable. He didn't speak. Judges rarely needed to, but the silence around him deepened in ways words could never replicate. The room hadn't been listening to him until now. It had been a Monday docket, nothing more. Routine foot traffic through the dusty arteries of municipal process. A parade of complaints, citations, half-formed legal language, tossed into the bureaucratic wind. And in the middle of it all, he sat elevated behind the bench, parsing through grievances like a tired conductor flipping through a set list he could conduct in his sleep. But something had stopped him. Not an objection. Not a procedural interruption. Just a page. His fingers, usually mechanical in movement, slowed over a line of text. His eyes narrowed not in confusion, but in recollection, the kind that tightens at the edges, where memory meets reverence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But those watching closely, the bailiff, the clerk, a woman 2 rows back with a thick folder of appeals, began to sense something unspoken settle over the courtroom. A tension not declared, but inherited. Whispers faded mid-sentence. Devices were silenced without instruction. Postures shifted. People sat up, leaned forward, not entirely sure why. Something in the air no longer felt procedural. The judge was reading, but not like before. His right hand stopped tapping the edge of his pen. His shoulders lost their practiced slump. The pages in front of him were no longer legal formality. They were narrative, record, history. He lifted the folder and angled it toward the desk lamp. Not for better lighting, for clarity. Her name, the one mispronounced minutes earlier, now seemed etched into something far older than court dockets. There was an origin to Ita Place far removed from city ordinances and traffic appeals. And now, that origin had found its way into his courtroom. She remained still. Not stiff, not anxious. Composed. Present in the way those who have already endured judgment tend to be. She knew he'd recognize it. Not the name, the legacy. And now he did. The room grew heavy with silence. Not the kind born of waiting, but of realization. No one yet understood the truth of what they were witnessing. But they felt it. He turned the page with deliberate care now. The kind of motion that comes not from curiosity, but from recognition, like handling a piece of one's own history found unexpectedly among routine debris. The judge had once authored part of the protocol he now held in trembling fingers, though under a different name, in a jurisdiction that didn't officially exist. 2 decades earlier, he had worn a different uniform, sat in a windowless room with people whose names were never written down, drafting wartime legal frameworks no civilian court was ever meant to see. And yet, here it was. The language was precise, cold, technical. Emergency Field Override Protocol active under Class Theta. Strategic conditions. Review authority limited. Jurisdiction suspended upon activation. He could have written it yesterday. Except now it bore her name, inked cleanly, initiated by someone far above his current authority. The designation wasn't a relic, it was a signal. He read it twice, then a third time, not to understand the already did, but to accept what it meant. Her name hadn't been there the first time the protocol had been drafted. It didn't need to be. The framework had been created to protect people like her. People who operated where law blurred into necessity, where decisions carried the weight of governments yet remained unrecorded. People who didn't leave footprints unless they chose to. He looked up from the folder, slowly. Not in confusion. That had passed. This was something else. Memory. Reverence. There she stood exactly as she had when she entered. Motionless. Silent. A gray coat buttoned to the collar. No expression on her face. But the lines around her eyes said enough. He had seen those lines before, just not on her. He'd seen them in photographs marked, "Destroy after review," on briefing packets that never left burn rooms. Eyes that had witnessed consequence at a scale most people couldn't imagine. She wasn't seeking judgment. She was returning it. He placed the file down, closed it softly, and folded his hands over the cover as if shielding something sacred. There was no legal path forward for this proceeding, not because it was flawed, because it was finished. The decision wasn't his to make. It never had been. The scar had always been there, sharp, pale, angled slightly above the temple, like a mark left by something that didn't miss. It had been visible since the moment she walked in, but only now did anyone begin to see it. Not as a blemish, not as a curiosity. As evidence. Not of pain, but of proximity to consequence. Her stillness began to take on shape. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the posture of someone who had waited in rooms where words could get people killed. Her back remained straight, not in defiance, but in discipline. Her gaze stayed forward, even as heads began to shift around the courtroom, drawn toward her not by sound, but by something quieter gravity, a stillness so dense it altered the air. A man seated near the back of the gallery, gray suit. Federal lapel pin faded with Agile leaned forward slowly. He studied her profile, eyes narrowing as memory caught up with recognition. Then he stood, carefully, whispering something inaudible to the woman seated beside him. She turned to look as well. Neither of them smiled. They didn't nod. They simply observed the scar and the way she didn't move and understood. The judge hadn't said a word, but his body had. His silence, stretched thin across the wooden bench, was no longer passive. It was a ritual. His hand, resting atop the closed file, no longer shuffled papers or grasped for pen or gavel. It stayed still, fingers lightly pressed against the manila cover like sealing a casket. No legal argument was spoken. No motion filed. This was no longer a courtroom in the traditional sense. It had become a moment suspended outside legal procedure, where power recognized power in its quietest form. The scar, once overlooked, now held the room. A symbol not of damage, but of duty, of someone who had crossed thresholds others wouldn't approach. The judge drew a slow breath and exhaled without sound. Then, with movements careful and measured, he adjusted the folder slightly and closed it with finality. No ruling, no explanation. Just a quiet, deliberate gesture. The case was no longer under review. It was under acknowledgement. No one in the courtroom could process what they were seeing, not at first. It happened without a sound, without warning. The judge, whose posture had remained rigid behind the high bench for the entirety of the morning, slowly rose. There was no gavel strike. No announcement, just motion, measured, intentional. He reached behind his neck, fingers brushing the seam of his robe with the familiarity of ritual. Not hurried, not performative. With both hands, he lifted the garment free of his shoulders, folding it along the lines of wear. The heavy black fabricants, a symbol of civic authority, hung briefly in the air before being placed, gently, on the bench. No one in the room spoke. They didn't have to. The silence held them still. He stepped down from the dais slowly, not like a man approaching a petitioner, but like a soldier returning to the presence of someone who had once led him through terrain no map could describe. His steps were deliberate, the path direct. Each footfall made the polished courtroom floor sound like stone under ceremonial boots. She remained motionless. She had not shifted since the moment her name had been called. Her hands still held the folded document. Her coat, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed nothing but restraint. Her eyes did not move to meet his. Not yet. She waited. She had been waiting since the moment she walked in. He stopped 2 paces from her table. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower than protocol allowed, but unmistakably clear. "You need not speak here." Her gaze lifted then, slowly meeting his. Not as a petitioner to a judge, but as one who remembered, one who understood exactly what was being acknowledged. The court clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard, unsure whether to continue documenting or simply witness. The bailiff had straightened, not out of obligation, but instinct. The judge did not return to the bench. He stood beside her, robe folded, gaze lowered not in shame, but in reverence. What remained between them was not a legal proceeding. It was recognition. Authority had shifted, not by force, but by gravity. And everyone in the room felt it. The courtroom remained still, but it was no longer quiet. The silence had shifted, thickened, become something else. It no longer felt like the absence of noise, but the presence of something unspoken, something ancient. The kind of silence that falls in places where history is written without ceremony. No one moved. The bailiff, who just moments earlier had been eyeing the clock and waiting for lunch break, now stood motionless near the chamber doors, unsure whether to speak, sit, or salute. The court clerk had frozen mid-keystroke, her fingers hovering over the F5 key like she was afraid a single stroke might fracture whatever was unfolding in front of her. The petitioners, seated in the gallery, previously preoccupied with traffic violations and disputed fees, had long stopped reading their notes. Even those unfamiliar with protocol could feel it. Something irreversible had occurred. And in the center of it all, she remained perfectly still. No words, no motion, no signal given. The judge stood beside her, the removed robe resting quietly on the bench behind him, like a shroud. He didn't speak either. He couldn't, not because he lacked the words, but because none were appropriate. He had already said what mattered with his posture, his decision, his silence. Language would have only diminished what was already clear. She nodded just once. It was not a submission. It was not thanks. It was the acknowledgement of mutual understanding between 2 people who had once been bound by a different systemone with no jury, no courtroom, and no appeals. The nod said, "You remember," and his silence said, "I do." Her presence had rendered the process unnecessary. The petition was not a plea. It was noticed. She was not seeking remedy. She was affirming that the mechanisms they had both once helped build, those forged in darker rooms, in times of crisis still had shape, weight, consequence. She had not come for justice. She had come to remind justice of what it owed itself. No one in the gallery would ever know the content of the file. No one would understand the shift in jurisdiction that had just taken place. But every person in that room would remember the silence. Because it wasn't absent. It was authority, absolute, quiet, and unshakable. By the end of the business day, her name no longer existed in the system. The docket log that had once listed her position in the morning queue, somewhere between a noise ordinance violation and a contested zoning fine, was replaced by a simple red line break. No case number, no timestamp. Just an absence that didn't explain itself. The digital interface that tracked municipal proceedings now showed an error where her file had once been accessible, followed by a replacement code that meant nothing to the clerks, but caused the IT supervisor to stop typing mid-password. That evening, 2 plainclothed men entered the municipal building just past closing. They weren't federal, at least not in the way people understood it. No credentials were displayed, no questions asked. They moved directly to the courtroom, then to the server access terminal. A senior staffer tried to inquire just once and was answered not with threat, but with the kind of clipped politeness that came from someone used to working in places where explanations weren't required. By the time morning arrived, the security footage from Courtroom 3B had been pulled. The backup files were gone. The courtroom camera, installed more for liability than oversight, now displayed a blank 62-minute gap for the time in question. And no one could find the physical folder, the paper copy, that had briefly sat on the judge's desk before he folded his robe. Most of the staff moved on, assuming some rare clerical error had triggered a procedural sweep. Maybe a sealed juvenile record, a misfiled federal transfer. Something mundane wrapped in bureaucratic miscommunication. But one clerk, an older woman with 2 decades behind that front desk, and a memory sharper than anyone expected, remembered something different. She had seen the header when the judge first opened the file. Just one line, half visible above the tab. Strategic Override. Class Zeta Wartime Ethics Protocol Originator. She hadn't spoken the words aloud. She hadn't dared, but she had written them down in the margin of her legal pad, just before her hand froze and her instinct told her to tear out the page. The paper is gone now. So was the pad. But the words stayed. Whispers began circulating in the break room and beyond about a case that never happened, a judge who broke protocol, and a woman no one could name but everyone suddenly remembered. It began as a rumor, unofficial, unverifiable, but whispered with the kind of weight that made people lower their voices without knowing why. Courtroom 3B, municipal level, early morning docket. A case, not listed on the public transcript. No footage, no file. But something had happened, something no one could explain, and no one could forget. The story spread first among courthouse staff, then to legal interns, then to clerks with military service. Within a week, it had entered the bloodstream of veteran circles, where no explanation was needed. They understood what others debated. They recognized reverence when they heard it in someone's voice. The details didn't matter. The silence did. Soon, law professors were citing the incident quietly, cautiously as a case study in a jurisdictional anomaly. They gave it a name, Where Justice Stood Still. Not a title, not a case number, just a phrase passed between scholars who sensed its gravity without needing to know its origin. They discussed the moment the judge rose, removed his robe, and stood at attention beside a petitioner who never spoke a word. They analyzed what it meant for judicial boundaries, for recognition outside of formal systems, for authority that did not announce itself, but made itself known by being still. Then the sketch appeared. Charcoal on cream paper. A woman at the petitioner's table, standing quietly. No expression, no motion, just presence. And beside her, a judge-not presiding, not speaking, but standing straighter than any portrait had ever depicted him, his hands at his sides, his head slightly bowed. The robe is absent from his shoulders. The moment was suspended. It went viral within days. No caption, no context. Just a title in the corner. She didn't need a gavel. Military forums reposted it. Law school classrooms printed it. An artist's signature in the lower right became the only traceable name in an image that otherwise belonged to no one. Some speculated the artist had been in the courtroom. Others believed it came from memory or reverence or both. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone who saw it understood. Justice had paused that morning, not to deliberate, not to decide, but to bow. And the world noticed. He submitted his resignation 3 days later, not in protest, not in shame, in alignment. The letter was handwritten deliberate cursive on cream stationery, not the templated digital form. He addressed it to the chief judge, signed it with his full name and former rank, and delivered it in person without a suit or briefcase. Just a folded envelope and a look in his eyes that said everything his words didn't. When asked for a reason, he answered only once. Some things deserve silence more than resolution. By the following semester, He had accepted a position teaching constitutional law with an emphasis on military-civilian legal intersections. The university listed it without fanfare. A visiting professorship, temporary, advisory. But those who attended his lecture as cadets, young lawyers, ROTC candidates, understood quickly that they were learning from someone changed. Someone who had seen authority bow to something older and heavier than the law. He opened every term the same way. No syllabus, no projector, just a story. He never used names, never cited the case, never referenced location or date. He spoke plainly like a man describing the shift of tectonic plates beneath a quiet sea. He spoke of silence as recognition of legal frameworks built not to contain power, but to understand it. He asked his students, "What do you do when the law meets something it cannot govern, but must still honor?" There was no answer, only thought, only the understanding that one day they might encounter something similar. And while no public document ever mentioned her, military academies began quietly updating their doctrine. Certain ethical override structures were rewritten, terminology changed. Marginal notes referenced, original language maintained per architect's precedent. Students learned procedures they would never be allowed to quote, frameworks adjusted to hold the memory of someone they would never meet. She was never seen again, not in courtrooms, not in commissions, not in whispered forums. But her name moved beneath the surface, not as rumor, but as architecture. The frameworks she'd created once buried beneath clearance codes, and forgotten authority now guided decisions, made in war rooms, tribunals, and silent operations no one would ever admit existed. Her legacy didn't demand credit. It shaped justice from the shadows, quietly, permanently.